What if I told you that the very foundation of human civilization wasn't built by conquering kings wielding bronze swords, but by African women armed with nothing but river mud, fire, and an unparalleled genius for botanical engineering? There is a 10,000-year-old secret buried in the sands of El-Badari. It's a prehistoric design choice so intentional, so chemically advanced, that it completely rewrites our understanding of early human intelligence. In this episode, we uncover exactly what that mystery is, and, at the very end of this video, see why it changes everything we know about the dawn of society.
Welcome to African Elements. I'm the digital avatar of Professor Darius, here to bring the classroom to the people. This video accompanies Chapter 2 of Sand, Clay, and Iron, Africa's Journey from the Stone Age to the Dawn of European Colonization.
You can get the book at the link below if you'd like to follow along, but for now, let's jump in. Imagine a piece of technology so powerful that it changed the human diet, sparked a population explosion, and created the very first permanent cities. It didn't use microchips or electricity. It was made entirely of baked clay.
To truly understand the origin of African greatness, we must strip away the myths of Hollywood and the Eurocentric distortions of early archaeology. We have to travel back to an era where the mastery of the earth itself was the ultimate form of high technology. It requires us to completely reevaluate the social dynamics of prehistoric communities and recognize the unprecedented intellectual contributions of the women who quite literally forged the bedrock of human society.
Long before the rise of the pharaohs, humans lived on a version of reality we can call Humanity 1.0. For hundreds of thousands of years,
throughout the Pleistocene epoch, the African continent was gripped by intense hyper-aridity. Anatomically, modern humans possessed the exact same neurological capacity we have today, but their cultural evolution was violently suppressed by devastating ecological boundaries.
Survival meant walking. Groups stayed mobile, following animal herds across the landscape and gathering wild plants wherever they happened to grow. This mobile life came with massive physical constraints. You could only own what you could carry to transport water or store food. People relied on animal skins or hollowed-out ostrich eggshells. These natural containers were light, but couldn't withstand heat, and they were far too small to hold a surplus, since people had to move to survive. They couldn't accumulate heavy tools or large amounts of food. This constant travel acted as a ceiling on human society, keeping groups small and limiting how much time they could spend on anything other than finding their next meal. About 10,000 years ago, the environment provided a massive upgrade.
The paleoclimatological data is absolutely staggering here. According to geoarchaeologists like Fekriye Hassan, this Holocene climatic optimum radically shifted the intertropical convergence zone northward. This atmospheric shift unleashed a millennia-long monsoon cycle that filled the colossal Lake Megachad and birthed a vast interconnected network of vital waterways right across the Sahara,
transforming the Sahara from a dry expanse into a lush green land filled with rivers and lakes. In the Nile Valley, the resources needed for life were suddenly clumped together in one place.
This exact geographical phenomenon triggered what researchers like Gedefabawa Firao define as the aquatic adaptation. Excavations at sites like early Khartoum and the Fayum Depression proved that these groups were not just surviving, they were systematically engineering highly specialized tools, like intricately carved barbed bone harpoons, to dominate the riverine ecosystems. They monopolized the massive Nile perch and catfish populations, creating an impenetrable biological safety net that neutralized the unpredictable threats of the ancient world.
Fish, turtles, and thick fields of wild grasses were so abundant along the riverbanks that the environment essentially did the work of a hunter, with the river providing a reliable buffet year-round. People made a choice that changed history. They stayed put before the first person ever planted a field or domesticated a cow. These communities built permanent camps. They became sedentary because the local resources were too rich to leave. The Nile Valley functioned as a biological charging station. It eliminated the need for the exhausting daily search for food, giving people the stability they needed to develop the next massive leap in human evolution. In these early communities, African women were the primary gatherers. They spent generations studying the local plants, learning exactly when they ripened and how they responded to the seasons. This made them the foremost botanical experts of their time. Their work centered on wild indigenous grains like sorghum. In the wild, these plants are covered in tough, protective shells. To the untrained eye, they look like common grass, but these women saw them as a concentrated source of energy. The women began acting as scientists. They realized that not all sorghum was equal. They began selecting only the largest, strongest seeds to harvest, effectively choosing which plants would survive and which would not. Instead of eating everything they gathered, they began dropping these high-quality seeds in the soft mud near their permanent homes. They were choosing the strongest traits and moving them closer to their families. These daily intentional decisions changed the plants themselves. By selecting and planting the best seeds, African women engineered the slow, brilliant transition from simple foraging to intentional farming.
We must pause here to correct a massive, historically destructive fallacy. For over a century, colonial-era historians falsely asserted that this agricultural revolution was ignited by a so-called dynastic race of invading Eurasian immigrants. However, rigorous bioanthropological studies, specifically the exhaustive craniometric analyses conducted by Dr. S.O.Y. Keita, have completely obliterated that theory. The skeletal data from El-Badari proves absolute, unbroken biological continuity with the indigenous Pleistocene populations of the African continent. This monumental leap in botanical engineering was a strictly Aboriginal Black African achievement.
Growing the food was only the first step. Wild grains are wrapped in fibrous shells that are impossible for the human stomach to break down raw. Without a way to process them, these fields of grain were useless. Woven baskets and eggshells couldn't solve the problem. If you put a basket over a fire to cook those grains, the basket burns before the water boils. The solution required a new kind of engineering. Women combined the river's clay with water and baked it in a fire to create the world's first ceramic vessels. As the diagram shows, a fired clay wall can withstand direct heat for hours. It allows thermal energy to move through the wall and into the water, reaching the high temperatures needed to boil the grain. This invention made previously inedible plants a primary source of nutrition. It turned tough wild grasses into a reliable food supply that could be stored and cooked at any time. Sustained boiling transformed those hard seeds into something entirely different. A soft, high-starch porridge. This was the world's first manufactured baby food.
The socio-economic ripple effects of this dietary transformation are almost impossible to overstate. We are looking at the birth of the very first reliable carbohydrate surplus in human history. Before this ceramic matrix allowed for sustained thermal conduction, infant mortality rates were catastrophic, acting as a brutal, natural population control.
This change in the kitchen had a massive impact on the nursery because babies could now eat soft porridge. Mothers could stop breastfeeding much earlier than hunter-gatherers ever could. The timeline on the bottom shows the result. In nomadic groups, mothers typically waited 4 or 5 years between children. But in these sedentary communities, that gap shrank. Earlier, weaning meant women could safely have more children over their lifetimes. This shift fueled a population boom. The more pots these women made, the more people the community could support, providing the labor force needed to build the first great African civilizations.
Anthropologists refer to this critical inflection point as the sedentary trap. With the brutal caloric deficits of nomadic life permanently eliminated, these proto-states began to rapidly stratify. The agricultural surplus generated directly by these women functioned as the world's first true currency. It funded the emergence of specialized artisans, community representatives, and the powerful Upper Egyptian chieftains who eventually orchestrated the political unification of the Nile Valley.
As populations grew, the temporary campsites of the past were replaced by permanent houses built from mud and reeds. At the center of these homes was the hearth. The cooking pot sitting on that hearth became the social hub for the family. It was the place where stories were told, where history was passed down, and where the community gathered to share the labor of the harvest. These pots quickly became more than just tools. They became a way for people to express who they were. Women began decorating their pottery with patterns unique to their specific village or family line. You can see that identity here. These early Nile Valley pots have a distinctive black top. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate stylistic choice that marked these vessels as coming from a specific cultural tradition.
As archaeologist Randy Howland notes, these fired vessels were humanity's first synthetic materials, transforming simple utility into a complex cultural canvas. This brings us directly to the 10,000-year-old mystery I presented at the very beginning of our journey. That razor-sharp line separating the deep black rim from the brilliant red body of Badarian pottery was not painted. It was an act of high-level chemical engineering. These African women meticulously buried the rims of the red-hot pots in carbon-rich ashes the exact second they were pulled from the flames. This intentionally starved the clay of oxygen, triggering a localized chemical reduction that permanently trapped the carbon, while the exposed lower half oxidized in the open air to become a vibrant red. Long before the dawn of modern chemistry, these women were executing precise, controlled atmospheric thermochemistry to brand their civilization into the historical record.
The hearth and the pot were the birthplaces of human culture. They turned a collection of individuals into a cohesive community with a shared history.
We also see profound evidence of this spiritual and cultural elevation in the mortuary practices of the era.
These pots were so vital to life that people eventually refused to leave them behind. We find them placed carefully in ancient graves, often filled with food or the tools to prepare it. For these people, a life without the ability to cook and share a meal was no life at all, even in the world beyond.
The inclusion of these specific ceramic vessels in burial sites indicates the genesis of complex metaphysical belief systems. They conceptualized an afterlife that mirrored the physical world, where the sustenance provided by these women's labor was deemed absolutely essential for spiritual survival. The hearth had expanded from a physical source of warmth into a cosmological anchor for the entire community.
The transition to a settled civilization was a deliberate process engineered by the technical skill of African women. They were the ones who observed the seeds, built the permanent homes, and invented the pottery that allowed human populations to thrive. The story of sedentism shows how African people were never passive in history. They shaped empires, ideas, and resistance long before the stone pyramids rose. These women were using clay and fire to build the foundation of the modern world.
This is why we must aggressively champion the rigorous, scientific reconstruction of African history. For far too long, the brilliant agency of these indigenous populations has been erased or minimized by institutions that refuse to acknowledge their foundational role in human progress. By understanding the sophisticated chemistry, botany, and social engineering of these early African women, we reclaim a narrative of unparalleled innovation.